You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hi there, and welcome to News Talks, the podcast in which we delve behind the headlines to discuss the biggest stories in global higher ed. I'm Narendra Pradhan, campus editor, and today we're discussing a story which has exploded well beyond the confines of higher education, namely the mass youth protests in India, which have now led to the resignation of the education minister and forced Prime Minister Narendra Modi into promising reform. So we'll be asking the question, how has a 2-month-old student protest movement ended up bringing down a minister in Modi's government? First, a quick explainer. Back in May, it emerged that questions from India's National Medical College entrance exam had been leaked and that more than 2 million students who had taken the exam would have to resit it. The anger, pressure, and in some cases despair felt when this news broke led to more than 20 students taking their own lives. It also sparked mass student protests under the banner of the new Cockroach Janta Party. Now, these rumbled on through much of June and into July, culminating in a violent clampdown by Delhi police on the 20th of July, which only added fuel to the fire, and ultimately the protests led to the resignation of then Minister for Education Dharmendra Pradhan. This was quickly followed by various conciliatory promises from Modi himself. So the protests have now paused, with those involved waiting to see if the government makes good on its promises. And here with me today to talk us through the finer details of why and how an exam leak could lead to the toppling of a government minister is our new Times Higher Education Asia reporter, Rosalind Skillen. Rosalind, great to have you on News Talks for the first time.
Thank you very much for having me on, Miranda.
Now, this is an extraordinary series of events that's culminated in the resignation of Dharmendra Pradhan, especially in an administration notorious for its strong rebuttal of any criticism or opposition. So for those who might be saying, how on earth has an exam leak sparked such a violent and angry, in some cases tragic, reaction, could you contextualise the place of the National Eligibility Cum Entrance Test undergraduate, or NEET UG, as this test is known? Could you contextualise its place in Indian education and society? Because this is not just any old test, is it? This is pretty high stakes stuff.
Yeah, you're totally right. It's not just any old test. Obviously, people will say, like in India, there's 2 default careers, medicine or engineering. And both engineering college entrance exams and medical college entrance exams are extremely competitive. They're highly selective and they're also really prestigious. So as you mentioned in the opening, this was sat by more than 2 million people, roughly 2.4 million people. And that probably is staggering to some of your UK listeners, the scale of that. And they're competing for 130,000 places. So it's a roughly 1 in 20 chance of success. So super competitive. This will have taken years of preparation, years of studying. Some of your listeners may know that the coaching college kind of system in India is quite prolific. So the fact that people would like remortgage their houses or sell their land to be able to afford to send their daughters or their sons to these coaching colleges that would prepare people for things like the medical college entrance exam. So really intensive, that spent loads of money to put children through these classes in the hope that then they'd achieve a really high score in the test. So I think that provides a little bit of context. And yeah, the fact that you said that more than 20 people died by suicide is a really important part of the story, because I think that highlights the fact that there's so much a mental load with tests like this. And that became one of the core demands for the Cockroach Janta Party, that there should be compensation for the families of those bereaved by children who died by suicide, because the test had to be resat months later, and this was with like extra security and stuff. So that prospect was, really overwhelming for a lot of students. And I think it's also important to highlight that this is kind of the latest exam leak in a long string of exam leaks. The opposition leader in India said that there's been 152 exam leaks in 10 years, which is really staggering. So this is obviously a catalyst for it, but I think that provides a little bit of the context around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned that families are remortgaging homes, selling property just to afford to get their children the necessary education and coaching to pass this. I guess that's indicative as well of the fact that in India there is such a kind of universal belief in education as the gateway to a better life. And that is the case for, millions, as you say, of Indians each year.
Mm.
However, I would say, despite all of that, it still doesn't fully explain why this particular leak led to quite such a strong reaction. Clearly, the exam leak was the spark for this mass outpouring of anger. But as an outside observer, it very much looks like this movement speaks to a much deeper discontent among the Indian youth. What's driving that anger?
I think you're right to identify that. I think there is like a general dissatisfaction with a lot of the policy agenda, I suppose, in India. And one of the big things is rising youth unemployment. And I know that this is not unique to India, it's not unique to Asia. This is something that a lot of countries around the world are grappling with. But again, I would argue that the problem in India is scale, because India has one of the world's largest youth populations. And there was really recent data from Bloomberg that shows that 1 in 4 graduates aged 15 to 29 are in regular salaried jobs. So that's only 1 in 4, which is crazy. And I think this mismatch is really frustrating people, because more and more people are enrolling in higher education. So more young Indians than ever are in higher education, but they're not getting a job at the end of it. And as you said, the role of education is so important in Indian society. And it's also long been seen as a tool for social mobility. But there's a mismatch then between people going to university and they're not able to get a job. So I think that's definitely one of the things. And then I spoke to a few young people who attended the protest, and they said to me, we're not protesting against one exam leak, we're protesting against a whole system. That's what one person said. And there's things like, infrastructure problems in India. Even like really recently in the news, I saw that one of the highways that they recently built was damaged and it couldn't work after all this money had been invested into it. There's problems with their ethanol fuel policy. They're blending fuel with 20% of ethanol. That sparked a protest, which will be happening in the middle of August. And then some of the young people that I spoke to also raised concerns around the Hindu nationalist agenda that's kind of driving Modi's government as well. So I think there's several factors and sort of a general dissatisfaction, as you identify. But it's interesting that a lot of these young people who were protesting would have been children when Modi was first elected 12 years ago, because he was elected in 2014, and now they're protesting. So I think that evolution, I suppose, is a really interesting one.
Yeah, that's quite a thought that during their possibly politically aware lives, they will have known nothing other than Modi. I mean, it sounds from what you say like there is just a really broad feeling of discontent with the government as a whole. You mentioned the ethanol fuel issues. I'd read that one of the companies selling this particular fuel that's causing the problems is owned by the sons of one of the ministers, which also points to, the ongoing issues around corruption in India, which the exam leak is clearly indicative of. And you can see that when it's then having really, really detrimental effects on all these incredibly hardworking young people's lives, how that would lead to a lot of anger. So there's been this bubbling discontent among India's enormous youth population for some time. How did the Cockroach Janta Party specifically come into being?
So it actually started as a joke, sort of like a satirical online campaign. It kind of came into being following comments from India's Chief Justice when he compared young people, unemployed young people in India, to parasites and cockroaches. And then the founder of the Cockroach Janta Party, I think we're just going to call it the CJP from now on. The founder of the CJP, Abhijit Dipke, posted on X, "What if all the cockroaches came together?" And I don't think he even anticipated how much momentum would come from that comment, because the post went viral. And then he was actually based in the US at the time, because he's a graduate of Boston University. He realized he was onto something. He flew home. He mocked up this AI generated logo of a cockroach. It's got its arms folded and it's wearing a pair of sunglasses. And then he named the party the Cockroach Janta Party, the CJP, and that's kind of a play on Modi's party, which is the BJP. So a bit of satire there. But I would say like social media was so big for this because the Instagram page of the CJP gained so many followers in the first few weeks. I checked yesterday, it's got 26.6 million followers on Instagram at the minute, and that's 6 times more than the government of India. And I think it's 3 times more than the BJP. So, you know, the scale again is just amazing. Social media was crucial to this, and then they wrote their manifesto and they had 3 core aims: to demand the resignation of the education minister, Dharmendra Pradhan, which we know now they did achieve that aim. The second was to withdraw the cases of all the protesters who were arrested or prosecuted by the police in the protests. And then the third was compensation for families affected by suicide following that NEET exam that we mentioned at the top of the podcast.
So it's, as you say, it started as a joke, and then Abhijit Ditka was, you know, good for him, kind of opportunistic, but spotted the power that this was suddenly generating, and has really kind of ridden that wave. And obviously had more of an impact than pretty much any other protest movement that Modi's government have faced in recent years, or possibly ever during their tenure. One of the things that is talked about beyond those kind of 3 key aims is the fact that there's clearly a bit of confusion as to exactly what the CJP does stand for. I mean, do we know anything else about it and what its longer term ambitions might be beyond these 3 key demands that it placed upon the government, or is that really where we're at with the CJP at the moment?
That's a really interesting question, because I did ask some people in India about this, and one of them did say to me, someone based in Kerala in the south of India, that they felt this was one of the flaws of the CJP, the fact that it didn't have this long-term vision. In some ways, that was a huge benefit. It had demands that were so specific, demands that they ultimately achieved, and I think that's but the specificity really helped the campaign. But now it's kind of like, where do you take it from there? And I know that they have said that they're going to be doing issues-based interventions, so they don't want to align with one political party. Interestingly, the opposition party in India only really kind of backed the CJP in the final week of the protests in Delhi, and when they were really gathering momentum, but they have said that they want to intervene on issues, which I think is really interesting, because it just shows like that really worked for them in education. And then, you know, if transport becomes a big thing, maybe we'll see intervention there, but I suppose there's no clear ideology, so it could really go either way.
Yes, and I mean it's quite clever because it does mean that, you know, anyone from any area of the political spectrum, if they care about that particular issue, can get involved and get behind them. And by not being politically affiliated, it sort of leaves you open to focus on the issues rather than the politics. One of the things that certainly was reported at the time when these protests really kicked off was that activist Sonam Wangchuk had joined the efforts by going on hunger strike. And I just wondered, who is Sonam Wangchuk and what's his role in all this? Why has he got involved?
Yeah, so he's an activist and an environmentalist from North India. He's also an engineer, and he's really famous in India because he was the inspiration behind a lead character in a very famous Bollywood film called The Three Idiots. I've actually seen that film, and it kind of gives you a flavour of just how intensive engineering colleges are in India, and it's like really funny and it's a comedy and stuff, but he's the inspiration behind the lead character for that. So he would be known really, really well in India, but also because of his environmental activism. But he went on hunger strike for 26 days. He only took salt and water. And again, I think that garnered a lot of sympathy, especially when he was removed and put in hospital. So on the 18th of July, I think it was maybe 21 days into his hunger strike, he was forcibly removed from the stage in the protest site. And again, that angered a lot of people because he was put into hospital against his will. So I think that grabbed headlines as well. But I think it's important to reflect on sort of the role of fasting in Indian society and Indian history. It really deeply resonates with people as a form of protest, and crucially a form of peaceful protest. Like Gandhi, who was the leader of the independence movement in India, fasted repeatedly. So it's seen as a way to, you know, successfully force those in power to act, but to do so in a peaceful way.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Now, coming back to the 20th of July, that was when things really kicked off in terms of the police retaliation escalating into violence. What did that trigger? I mean, can you explain how the protests escalated at that point?
So it really kicked off on the 20th of July. But I think it's also important to highlight that there was like 5 weeks of momentum. So protesters had been camping overnight for weeks in this designated protest site in New Delhi. It's called Jantar Mantar. So it's an old observatory. It's also a designated site for protest in the country's capital. And it's interesting actually in recent days because that's now being assessed whether it should still be a designated protest site after what happened with the cockroaches. But yeah, so on the 20th, there was an organised march to Parliament and an estimated 50,000 people, which is insane. And basically they attempted to march to Parliament, but they were met with tear gas from the police, pellet guns, batons. And I think the police brutality that really, again, like deepened sympathy for the CJP and all the protesters. And it kind of only made the protesters dig their heels in further, and the mass demonstrations continued. And although it was kind of Delhi that grabbed the headlines, there were also protests in other parts of the country, in Mumbai, in Bangalore, that kind of thing. And then by the end of the week, the Education Minister, Dharmendra Pradhan, had resigned. And then what was a site of protest became a site of celebration. And I'm sure a lot of listeners will have seen those videos or those photos all over news outlets across the world of all the young people celebrating the resignation of the Education Minister.
Yes, and rightly so, in the sense that they had achieved what many others had failed to achieve before them. But on that note, what are the key attributes of the CJP that set it apart or make it differ from previous opposition or protest movements faced by Modi?
I would say there's three things, Miranda. The first one is that it's like young people, which gives it a certain energy, I suppose, and a certain momentum. And also by default, I guess that meant like a lot of it was online organising and the power of social media. I think that's so important. One side plot is when people discovered that the education minister had actually sent his daughter overseas to Tufts University in Boston. Like, the university Instagram page went crazy. I was looking at the comment sections. There was like thousands of comments, like hashtag Dharmendra Pradhan resign, people saying like how Tufts University had allowed Dharmendra Pradhan's daughter to graduate. She actually had to deactivate her Instagram account, the former education minister's daughter. So, there was just so much on social media, so much content. And I think that's really important, and that ties into the youth element. The other thing is that this wasn't a protest about religion or caste, it was a protest about education. And as you mentioned, that is just such a core part of values, I suppose, in India. It's a core value in India. And the fact that, one person who attended the protest said to me, like, when you start school, you're taught you study hard, you work hard, you get a good life. Education is seen as the path to social mobility, and the fact that that was seen as being disrupted by these leaks, by that concept of unfairness, I think really angered people. And then the third thing I would draw out is probably just humour. I watched an interview with Arundhati Roy, who won the Booker Prize. She's an author and an activist in India, and a lot of people would know her. And she talked about this. She thought that the humour of the CJP was kind of a counterpoint to the politics. And for example, when Modi went on and he posted those reels in the week during the Delhi protests, he tried to kind of quell the dissent. And he went on Instagram and tried to post these reels saying like, okay, we're going to listen to the voice of youth. And then because he had like filmed the video, his face was really close to the camera. And then all these comments saying like, oh my gosh, he doesn't know how to make a reel. And everyone kind of crucified him over that and tore him apart over that. And then he posted a reel the next day saying, thank you for your tips. I'm going to try again and do another Instagram reel. So I think there were elements of humour and satire throughout, which really made it different to anything that we've seen before.
Yeah, well, it brings in the human element, doesn't it? Which is always helpful. And then the other point you made about education being such a core value, of course, it's important to remember that while many of the people out on the streets of Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore were young, of course, their parents probably were also fairly invested in this. If these are the people that have moved cities, sold homes, invested huge amounts of very hard-earned money into educating their children and made huge sacrifices for it, they're going to also be behind this. So I guess in that sense, it also kind of crossed generations. Behind the headline-grabbing resignation of Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan, what has the CJP actually achieved so far?
I think one of the crucial things is that they have a voice, that they know they have a voice and they have momentum. And they did achieve their core demands. They say they achieved their core demands around the fact that they wanted the cases to be withdrawn of people who had attended the protests for them not to be arrested or prosecuted by the police. I know that the police have been kind of tracking down people in recent days, so I'm still unclear as to whether that demand has been achieved concretely. But then the third one around getting compensation for the families who were bereaved by suicide. And I think it's interesting because obviously the resignation of the education minister in itself, that is something which, like, that is the first senior ministerial resignation in Modi's government. And also the party said in 2015, it was really famous at the time, like, oh, we don't do resignations. We're not like other political parties. We don't do resignations. And that remark has resurfaced in recent days, and it's kind of fallen under the weight of everything that's happened in recent weeks. But in terms of other concrete things, I suppose Modi promised to set up these fast track courts to sort of accelerate the harsher punishments for people who have allegedly leaked exams, to introduce harsher punishments for that. But again, the first hearing to deal with that NEET paper leak, the medical college exam, it was adjourned on the 27th of July because no one turned up on the part of the government, so the Central Bureau of Investigation. So it's unclear. I think the fast track courts are already super backlogged. There's like 250,000 cases already since the end of 2025. So people aren't too hopeful that that's going to make a huge difference. Fast track courts are supposed to deal with something within a year. And then the other thing that Modi did was he set up a task force, so 6-member task force to deal with educational reform and to kind of make exams leak-proof, as it were. And the lead man who's going to be leading on that, he's a tech entrepreneur, so he's founder of a technology company called Infosys, which is quite well known in India. So he's kind of seen as this safe pair of hands, a very credible name. But it was noted that there was only one person from academia who was on this task force. So that's the IIT Madras director. He's on the task force. But those are kind of concrete things, I suppose, that have come out of it. But it's still unclear as to what the impact of those will be.
Yeah, of course. Whether the government will follow through on all its promises. As you say, it's a little unclear if the promise that there'd be no police follow-up on the protests is actually being enacted at this stage. Okay, so the current status quo is that the protests have been called off on the basis that the government agreed to the key demands. But Modi is not exactly known for his willingness to listen to or bend to his critics' wishes. So what is the general consensus over the likelihood of long-term reform from this?
I would say from the people that I spoke to, both students, people who attended the protests, and scholars in India, that there isn't much hope. People are quite sceptical, I would say. One scholar said that really what was needed was like a structural overhaul, so to properly invest in public universities. And that's something actually that we haven't touched on, but from what I understand, there was also dissatisfaction with the increasing privatisation of the university sector in India. So the sector has been increasingly privatised, and public universities, therefore the places are more competitive. And it's that question of like, can you only have a good education if you have money? And also private universities are seen to be of less quality than public universities. Like, people really want to get into a public university rather than a private one. So proper investment in public universities is something which people were talking about. And then just involving individuals with experience of academia and experience of how to run educational systems, involving them in policy making would be really important. But I suppose like this thing of like, how do you make exams leak proof? It's, yeah, when you consider the fact that there's been 152 paper leaks in 10 years, as we said at the beginning, it does appear to be quite a challenge.
Yes, yeah. I mean, have you sort of spoken to anyone and got any ideas on what sort of reform might actually work in terms of improving the integrity of India's exam system? Are there any ideas floating around as to what could be done?
Yeah, I suppose sanctions and harsher punishments for people who do leak exam papers. Typically, it's leaked to like the highest bidder, or for example, it could be leaked to one of the coaching centres that we talked about as well. And just enforcing compliance, and making sure that all the protocols are in place. But again, what that looks like, yeah, it's still unclear to me.
Yeah, and arguably, if you're going to continue with a system where there's so much importance placed on one exam,
Mm,
that's always going to create incentives for misconduct, whether it's on the
yeah,
student side or indeed the organizational sort of structural side, possibly less focus on just a single exam being the only metric by which these students are tested or the key
yeah.
metric by which they're tested. There may be quite a strong argument for that, but of course, that's a huge structural overhaul of a system that needs to test more than 2 million students, which is quite hard to wrap one's head around. It is easy to look at this and think, wow, this should make other governments around the world really sit up and pay attention because, as you've rightly pointed out, youth unemployment is a problem in many, many countries. There's growing intergenerational inequality in many countries, and a general sense that older folk are sort of somewhat betraying their children's futures and breaking the social contract of, if you work hard, you'll do well. That is undoubtedly mirrored in many places, and the anger about that is mirrored with some justification. Do you think that these kind of protests are something that could be paralleled or could happen in another country, or does this reflect circumstances that are particularly unique to India and its culture, its politics, its history?
Yeah, I sort of think the latter, Miranda. Like from what I read online and from speaking to people, there was caution about comparing these protests to other parts of Asia. Like I know, for example, the anti-corruption protests in Bangladesh, or there's been like a myriad of examples of protests in Asia over recent years among young people. But I think this was really specific in the sense that it was about education, it was about an exam paper leak. But then on the flip side, it was that almost was the entry point into a conversation around much broader failures. It was kind of like one exam leak came to symbolize broader governance failures. And I saw online so many times people saying, oh, this wasn't just about one exam leak, it wasn't about the resignation of one minister, it was about all these issues to do with infrastructure, unemployment, all this kind of thing. But I think the fact that you have highlighted it as well, that education occupies such an important role in India. That's also very unique. And then I think the humour and also the fact like the symbol of the cockroach was everywhere. This just grabbed headlines everywhere because that was just so, again, specific. And then I think as well, because it's India, like the scale of this is just staggering. We're talking one of the world's largest youth populations. It was just insane. And seeing pictures of the protests in Delhi, it was astonishing number of people and just astonishing that so many people came together and that yes, it did look like it erupted out of nowhere, but now with the wider context we can kind of piece it together and shape a narrative around it. But I think yeah, everyone was just glued for the week because it was very, very climactic that week, especially with the protests in Jantar Mantar in New Delhi. And the fact that, yeah, at the start of the week, it was a site of protest, then it became a site of celebration, and so much intensity there, I suppose, for onlookers outside India. But yeah, I think this is certainly different. And also the fact that it kind of represents the first crack in Modi's armour, as it were, because typically he runs a very tight regime and there hasn't been much political opposition. But this is one of the largest anti-government protests that we've seen in recent years.
Yeah, and as you say, the speed at which this has all taken off is unbelievable. A couple of months ago, there was no rumblings of any of this. And 2 months later, here we are with Modi's government having been forced to concede things which most people would have never thought possible. As with many things in India, also, I think you're right, the intensity of it, it's like everything happens in a kind of on a level of technicolor that is quite hard to imagine in many other countries.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating stuff. Thank you, Rosalind, for bringing us all up to speed on this powerful new force in Indian society.
Thank you very much, Miranda.
It'll be really interesting to see if the CJP does decide to use its influence to pursue further reform. Although, as with any complex problem, many of the drivers of youth unemployment and inadequate education provision could take years to sort out. So, this is not going to be a quick fix. Thank you to all of you for listening. We will be back in a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, you can find many more episodes of News Talks at timeshighereducation.com/podcasts. Bye bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.